Today we're going to talk about how to find the domain of a function. So the first type of function we're going to look at is a rational function. And rational functions are going to have a denominator. Now we know with a fraction that we don't want our denominator to be equal to 0. Otherwise, this would be undefined. So what we do is we take that denominator, set it equal to 0, and solve, and then this becomes the value that we must exclude from the domain, because if x was equal to 1/2, this fraction would be undefined. So our domain, I'm going to write it in interval notation, would be all reals except for 1/2. Now sometimes we need to exclude more than one value, and that's okay. So let's say we have x squared over something like that. So it doesn't really matter what's going on in the numerator. It's the denominator that we're concerned with. We do not want the denominator to be equal to 0, so we find out where it would be equal to 0. So that's going to happen when x is equal to positive or negative 3. So we need to exclude both positive and negative 3, and again in interval notation, the domain would look like this. The second type of function we're going to look at would be functions with radicals. Now we can have 0 under the radical, because the square root of 0 is just 0, that's fine. But we don't want any negatives. So what we do is we take the expression underneath the radical, and we set it greater than or equal to 0, because we only want positive values or a 0 value. We solve, and in interval notation, this is our domain. So we can substitute any number in this domain in for x and get either 0 or a positive. Our third category here would be linear or quadratic functions. So linear functions or quadratic. And under the category of linear, we could even include absolute value. Now what these functions have in common is that they will never be undefined. You won't be able to find an x such that if you evaluate any of these functions at that x, that the function would be undefined. So the domain for these functions is going to be all reals. And here is our summary. So to find the domain of a rational function, what we do is we set the denominator equal to 0, we solve that equation and then exclude the values from the domain. Second, if we want to find the domain of a radical function, we set the radicand, so just the expression underneath the radical, greater than or equal to 0, and we solve that inequality for the domain. And third, some functions, like linear functions and quadratic functions, will have a domain that is all real numbers.